Good to go.
Okay.
Cool. All right. All yours.
I'll take a few minutes to rant over some of the basic concepts, and then we could all play around with them. Some of the things will make sense, some will seem obscure. That's all good. I'm going to touch on two main things. One is what I mean by post-metaphysical, and the other is my general sense or my attempt to define what's happening when we have spiritual or religious experiences and when we do spiritual or religious practices. So let's start with post-metaphysical. It's a fancy word I happen to like. What does it mean? It means we're looking back on metaphysics, evaluating it, pruning it, exploring it as if from the outside, but that's not the same as totally rejecting metaphysics. You can never completely get free of it. You can only do it better or worse. Every kind of invisible or immaterial pattern is metaphysical. Anything that isn't a physical object, so ghosts and gods, sure, but also logic and identity and comparison and selfhood. Some of those things we can do away with, some we still need, some are fuzzy concepts that need to be tweaked. We tend to imagine this thing with scientists and atheists complaining that traditional thinkers are metaphysical and superstitious. But there's actually a lot of practicality in traditional viewpoints and a lot of unproven invisible powers in modern science. Truth is metaphysical. The absolute equality of an equal sign is metaphysical. Even the idea that things are what they are and that we know what we know is metaphysics in a sense. So post-metaphysics isn't about, the simplistic argument between modern and pre-modern views of the universe. It's really about a participatory, skeptical way of being, a way that's independent of your view of the universe. And skepticism turns out to be really perfectly acceptable in authentic religion and spirituality. Ontological wiggle room is good. Like really believing in angels or really believing in quantum mechanics, that's not what makes it work. What makes it work is what you do in a world of endlessly incomplete knowledge. So post-metaphysical spirituality cares a lot about spiritual practices, cares a lot about spiritual experiences, doesn't care so much about the beliefs or the worldviews that they get packaged in. You don't need to believe in Shiva to do yoga. You don't need to believe in Jesus in order to benefit from praying to Jesus. You don't need to believe in subtle energy to explore its health effects. You don't even need to believe in God in order to literally see God and have that change your life. As humans, we tend to want to honor important things by describing them as really real. But that also traps us in our interpretations and cuts us off from ongoing investigation with other people who have other ways of saying what they think is really real. So I'd say we can honor things of ultimate importance, maybe better by handling them gently, giving them space to breathe and change and be doubted and played with. All right, so that's post-metaphysics. We've got this relaxed, engaged skepticism that emphasizes experience and practice rather than beliefs and assertions. So what are these practices that are going on in all the different forms of religion and spirituality? What's their general common characteristic? Right, that's open to investigation, but to investigate that, we have to get past the kind of narrow modern idea that religion is just some failed proto-science that's perpetuated in famous membership groups like Christianity and Islam and Buddhism. That stuff's interesting, but it's the tip of the iceberg. Most religion and spirituality took place in the tens or hundreds of thousands of years before recorded history. Most of it involved very little symbolism, very few buildings, very little speech, and no books at all. So most religion has occurred without the concept of religions. If an alien anthropologist showed up to study religion today, he might think churches were just museums, and he might focus more on backyard barbecues and voting procedures and sexual practices, and have very little interest in what category of belief a person might verbally claim to be in. So I'd argue that people who consider themselves to be religious are actually a very small minority in the history and the current reality of human religion. It's a much more natural phenomenon than that. It's more colloquially. You tend not to see it when you're in it. But that doesn't mean it's not a specific thing. It does have particular qualities that we can start to tease out if we look at it in a really broad way. When I was a kid, I saw this episode of Seinfeld. Maybe you've seen it. George Costanza decides to do the exact opposite of every instinct he has because he thinks his instincts are so bad. And this quickly starts to work out for him. Everything starts coming together as if some extra force were coordinating his life. Now he's having peak experiences. Now he's got this extra quality of trust and meaningfulness. So he goes to his friends and he says, look, this isn't a joke, you guys. This is my religion. And he's right. It's a way of behaving that brings together all the parts of his life and goes beyond his normal feeling of identity into some excess radiance. That's actually a really good example of what I think religion is. The big famous religions from the last few thousand years are versions of this process that emerged where a bunch of people started living in a way that brought together all the different parts of their lives and evoked a vibe or a spirit that was more than the sum of its parts. They religionized their lifestyle by successfully getting this feeling of super coordination and some extra good momentum or grace. And if that works, if those procedures are operative, then a new spirit seems to be moving in the world, giving rise in them to a new and unique way of living well. It's like the instruments in the given context are now being orchestrated into a symphony through a reflective relationship to this excess that they've produced. And this could happen in any culture, any epoch. It can happen with any type of politics or science or technology. So in like Paleolithic times, this involved bringing together the art and science and medicine and mysticism and politics and diet and sex of the Paleolithic era. Religion then was a successful blending of all those different facets of life. But in traditional Europe, say, it involved traditional monarchy politics, a god-king religion, and classic Aristotle science and agrarian mythology and feudal economics, perfectly appropriate to their world space. And in modern or postmodern or metamodern eras, it should likewise involve the convergence of all the modern, postmodern, or metamodern genres of social activity, all the facets of our lives. And wherever that works, science is being included at each of these stages. Pre-modern religion will seem anti-scientific to you if you're a modern person, but all that means is that modern religion has to integrate modern science. And if it doesn't do that, it isn't religious in the modern world. This is an active process. If you look around and you say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, I think that really just means that the religion for the stage that you're at or the kind of culture you live with isn't being adequately cultivated around you. The faith-making machinery of the society isn't operating. So yeah, my actual proposal, a little more abstractly, is this, that religion and spirituality are both processes of integrating functional systems into a harmonious balance that exceeds the sum of its parts, and then becomes available for people to enter into a creative relationship with, a relationship that justifies, orients, and empowers their inner and cultural life. So with religion, these different systems are the different genres of cultural activity: poetry, mysticism, diet, politics, science, philosophy. And with spirituality, these systems are the different parts that make up the community of our inner psychology: heart, mind, and body, left and right brain, perception of self, perception of other, masculine, feminine, the 7 chakras. There's lots of different ways to divide up our inner subsystems. But when our practices are yielding results, it's because of a yoking together, a synergistic coordination of our faculties that yields an overtone or an extra degree of coherence that overflows into something more. And that more can be seen through different lenses. It can seem like a higher self. It can seem like a higher other being. It can seem like a special energy. Those are all valid, partial interpretations. Our spiritual life and our religious life is what happens when we produce this moreness and then negotiate between this numinous extra and our regular activities, relationships, and ideas. All right, that's kind of an overview. It's probably plenty. Where do you want to go with that?
Whoa, yeah. Thanks, Layman. Awesome explanation. I hope that you guys could follow at least some of that. You went over a lot of different things, and it was like your vocabulary is awesome. So it's cool to watch you talk and conceptualize. We're gonna open it into like a conversation, like kind of a Q&A thingy.
Yeah,
or
terrific.
however we want to do with it. But does anyone want to start with like a question or any kind of comment? And we can kind of get the conversation rolling.
Well, one thing, I don't know, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Yeah, Layman, one thing that came up for me in the earlier part of your talk was something that I had read years ago about something called radical atheism, where it was like, for a radical atheist, it's not about actually believing in anything. It's all about the rituals, knowing what the rituals are. And so it's more the emphasis is on the enactments. And so that's when I think of post-metaphysical, I think of the enactment rather than some pre-existing, some given God or given spirits. It's about what you create through your enactments. And I just was curious what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. And it's nice to see you, Joseph.
Great to see you too. It's been a long time.
There's definitely a dynamic aspect to this and a creative aspect. It's about the kind of experiences that we can evoke through our participation in the world, and not so much about the idea that there's definite realities that are pre-given to us. Now, there may or may not be certain kinds of definite realities that we have to assume in order to have experience in the first place, but those are pretty minimal compared to what people have traditionally just assumed was already part of reality. So you can be perfectly religious and think you're an atheist. There's no incompatibility there. It's what you practice and the results that you get from it, right? The experience that one person might attribute to believing in something, another person might get that same degree of experience or even a more intense experience and attribute it to not believing in that thing. So the procedures put no limit on the intensity of the experience that we can have, but it is definitely enactment based, participatory.
The other thing that came up was you spoke about the excess that's generated. So that, in my mind, is sort of brought this idea of you're creating, and everybody's familiar with this term of a social holon. So you're creating something that creates this excess that you talked about, and that sort of reminded me of something that I had read a while back. It's like how things are created at every level. Like, when two atoms get together and they form a molecule, it's like, what is a molecule to an atom? Maybe to an atom, a molecule is God. That next higher level thing that's created, and there's some sort of downward causation or some sort of excess that's felt from this larger thing that's created. And so, in that sense, religion, in that sense, would be like, this happens at all levels of reality. From atoms forming molecules, or people getting together in a group, where the group becomes something more than just a bunch of people in a room.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's an inner version of that, which I'm calling spirituality. We could call it something else. And there's a social version of that, which is what I'm calling religion. And it can happen if you imagine reality as a series of nested levels. Then the emergence of each one of those levels would involve this process, right? That the parts would coordinate and they would produce a way of collaborating that had a kind of characteristic of its own and began to act as an operator condition, pulling the parts forward in that direction. It would start to supervene on them, right? And that would happen at each of these stages. And it's equally divine and equally holy in the experiential sense at each of these stages. Right, we might think that we might not be too impressed with the degree to which a molecule supervenes over an atom. But anytime anything supervenes over its parts, it's tremendous. It's amazing. And it doesn't have to be infinite, right? I always use this example of how you could drown in a few inches of water, right? It seems to you that it's an endless amount of water at the point where it completely covers you. But you have no idea, and in fact, you don't need to stipulate that it is an objective infinity. It just has to be enough to get beyond your situation and yourself and the level where you're at. It will be indefinite at that level. It'll be an indefinite excess that allows the parts at your current level to come together. And if a new stage or a new structure was going to form over that, this would be the precondition for that formation.
I have to
Yes, yes, a molecule is a god to an atom. Sorry.
Nancy, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have two comments. The first one is, in the beginning you said that praying to Jesus, even if you don't believe in Jesus, would be still as effective. But within Christianity, the whole point is that you should believe in him as the Son of God. Otherwise, it wouldn't really work to pray to him. That's the whole point. So that was my comment on your first, the first thing you said. And then another comment on what Joseph just said about molecule being the god for an atom. Well, we just, well, not just, a few years ago, found the Higgs boson particle, which is also called the God particle. So it doesn't have to be that it supersedes, it is bigger than the atom. It could also be something smaller, which is inside the atom. So I just had to think about it. I thought it was funny.
Yeah, that's a humorous reversal, although I think the framework of the cosmos in which we understand the Higgs boson to exist is a greater framework than the framework of the molecule's existence. So just because something's physically smaller doesn't mean it's not part of a larger context. Now, to the Jesus thing, that's a very interesting point. And when I was talking about how the process of religionization would work in different cultures at different time periods, we can look at cultures that are based on belief and membership and a very socially reinforced idea of what real things are really real. Now, in that kind of a world, among that kind of a society, they would, of course, describe the process in terms of asserting your really real belief. But other levels of culture can also be religious and enact these same things, and they don't have that same degree of believer assertion. And I think one of the basic things is, even among people who describe what they're talking about as believing in Jesus, you could hold that very tightly as if it's an absolutely really real thing, or you could hold that very loosely. Right? You can perform the same procedure, just like you can perform with your body a procedure in a fluid, relaxed way, or in a very tight, strident, assertive way. I think there's a way of understanding what they're saying that can be totally compatible with this. And there's another way of understanding what they're saying, which I would say is probably degenerate, right? So one of the things I didn't mention is, if there's a process of religionization, if religion isn't a belief system, it's an activity that you do to produce this surplus, that activity can fail. Or people who've been doing it successfully for a while can go off track and start doing it wrong, right? They can become maladaptive procedures. And something that started out as a really religious phenomenon could keep going using the same language and start becoming a degenerative phenomenon, that instead of reaching that next stage is actually breaking down into the parts of the previous stages that it's built on.
Nancy, any follow-up comments there? And also, Jeremy, welcome to the
Thank you.
hangout. Just for context, we're talking a little bit about post-metaphysical spirituality. I don't want to explain it because Layman, you'll do a way better job to explain it than me. But we're talking basically about like almost like new spirituality and religion, and what that essentially means in today's world.
Okay.
So just to bring you into the conversation a bit.
Yeah, so my follow-up was to what Layman just said. You were talking about religion, and it could be, depending on how you interpret it, it could be loosely held or not. But the whole point is, at least related to Christianity, the whole point is that the most Christians agree on, because even within Christianity, I know this is point that is up for debate, is that it's not about the religion in the sense of the practice itself, like the rituals, but like actually meaning it and having a relationship with God and Jesus. It's not about just going to the church and making a cross and saying whatever words, but actually meaning it. So then it's not a ritual that you are just practicing.
Well, I would say two
The
things.
meaning behind the practice.
Yeah, on the one hand, there is what we know about human organisms now is that a lot of our internal experience is shaped by our external behavior. And Pascal in the 1600s was famously said, we don't kneel down and pray because we believe because we kneel down and pray. So there's always been this discussion within Christian theology about which part is the more fundamental part. But what we need to do, I think, is understand that ritual and practice is not just superficial social engagement, right? Like in Buddhism, for example, there's a great number of practices where you intentionally specify the types of thoughts or the types of emotions, the types of mental states you're going to work on. It's the same thing in Christianity to some degree. And people historically, with a limited vocabulary for these processes, might have said something like, you need to really believe in it. And what they might have been saying is, here's how you need to do the ritual practice internally, right? It's not just going to the church. Thinking a thought is part of a procedure of enactment. Having an emotion is part of a procedure of enactment. So these things, treating it seriously might be the recipe for pulling the procedure off. But that doesn't mean that when you pull back, you absolutely need to accept the ontological reality of these things in order to do them. Now, I know that a lot of people historically, or during the last few thousand years, have equated the conversation about belief with the efficacy of the religion. But you actually can do the experiment with people who don't believe in things. And if they do certain practices for a while, they start to have experiences with those things. It can be done. You know, we can explore whether or not it's possible to do it outside of the belief context. The believer groups have always insisted that you can only do it in their context, but neurological and psychological studies on human beings show that you can do it outside that context.
Yeah, so you're talking about the body-mind connection.
Definitely.
Yeah, okay.
I wanted to say one thing to one of your questions, Nancy, where you talked about the Higgs boson particle. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. What came up for me when you mentioned it, and I'm not that familiar with it. I know I read about it a while back. I guess that's like one of the smallest particles that goes up into the makeup of an atom. Is that right? So something like that. Well,
so far, yeah.
So what came out for me is that, you know, there's the two aspects of the divine. There's the immanent and the transcendent. So from the point of view of an atom, the molecule as God would be the transcendent aspect. But also there's the immanent, which is within the atom itself, you know, the infinite depth. So
That's a nice explanation.
Does anyone else? I mean, yeah, Karish.
Yeah. I was going to ask, kind of in reference to what we were kind of talking about before, but in reference to Christianity as religion, it's widely a huge core of it is that Jesus rose from the dead, and because of that, that's why people believe in that religion. And so my question would be, could you believe in the resurrection of the dead, but not have faith that Jesus rose from the dead, and because of that, we have the power of Christianity?
Well, you have the option of doing it in any number of different ways, right? You can, the whole point of this is there's no particular privileged version of how you hold the concepts that is what makes it work. You could affirm this part and not affirm this part. You could affirm this part 80% and this part 40%. There's all these different ways to hold all the different pieces. And I think what we see is if we pull out of any given belief context and look at all the different belief contexts and also the experiences of people who don't think they're in belief contexts, they all have these experiences. They all can access equivalent degrees of profundity. And they all affirm some parts of reality and not affirm other parts of reality. So the description of what all of that is altogether is something where we have to existentially hold everything a little bit lightly, right? We are dialing things up and dialing things down. And if a person were to believe a certain aspect, they might believe in the resurrection of dead, but not believe in a literal resurrection of a historical person. Or that's something that might change for them over time, right? 10 years from now, they might find that they're 15% less sure about that, or 20% more sure. There's just an enormous arena of flexibility on these topics, which means that when we think about them, we can't just think about them in terms of the propositional truth of what any given group is claiming. There's lots of different groups making lots of different claims. Everyone in those groups is holding those things differently. And other people outside those groups who don't believe anything like that are having basically the same experiences under different conditions.
I'm reminded of I think he was basically a Roman Catholic philosopher, but he was George Santayana, I think, but that could be wrong. But anyway, he said one of his famous quotes was, "There is no God and Jesus is his mother." And he kind of said that because he couldn't get himself to believe in the actual the fundamental prescripts of Catholicism, but he found that the structure and the ritual and all of the things that kind of made kind of an orchestration to his life, those were very valuable, even though he didn't actually get himself to believe in the literal truth of the resurrection and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know if you wanted to go anywhere with that, but it's just something that made me think of when you were talking about that kind of thing.
Yeah, Santayana is terrific. And I think one of the things for me that points to is the conversations that religious people have been having for thousands of years. They've gained insight into a lot of the structures about how this procedure operates. A lot of the high theological language, a lot of the symbolism, a lot of the ritual and tradition, the outer and the inner practices, a lot of that both represents for us the idea of accessing a numinous power, but also might instantiate concepts about how that process works that we don't normally hear about in our regular life. Especially if you come out of a European background, then Roman Catholicism might be the great, beautiful architecture of how you think about those things. And those grand Catholic theological concepts might be your way to get into how that process works. But the key thing is that there is some process there that either works or doesn't work, right? Your religion is either successfully religioning or not. Your spiritual practices are either doing it or they're not doing it. And it wouldn't matter what you believed in either case, unless your practice was specifically a belief practice.
So you're actually saying, you're going back to the law of attraction. Whatever you believe is true because you believe it.
I think access to realities is based on actions and enactments. One of the ways to do something is to believe. It's not the only way to do something. You could, by believing, cause a change in your experience. You could also cause a change in your experience by other methods.
So I have a question, or just a comment or something. If you were to kind of like take a step back and like you're aware of that you're living in a world where we have like unlimited religious and spiritual options, and you kind of affirm that you just were kind of agnostic about everything and had that kind of healthy skepticism that you described, you're kind of presented with this overwhelm of freedom or overwhelm of choice with the buffet, the endless buffet of like spiritual and religious rituals and practices to like engage in. How do you go about navigating through that buffet and endless supply of options? And how does one like find what ritual, whether it's religious or not, they should maybe subscribe to or focus on?
Yeah, it's tricky. If we look at this phenomenon as occurring at different moments of history, really early moments of history are situations in which it occurs with fewer options, less information, less culture than we have today. So the complexity of the information situation has just been growing and growing. It might have been much easier to bring together all the parts of your life when nobody knew anything, so to speak, than it is today, when you might have to surf an endless amount of incoming digital information. But the basic procedure would be the same in terms of your spiritual practice. It wouldn't make a difference. You still only have the same functional parts of a human being that every other human being in history had. So you got to bring those together by some kind of practices internally. Socially, you have to start looking around at what are the parts of your life, how do they come together, and do you see anybody who is bringing together a lot of those different parts? Because you absolutely can piggyback this procedure on inherited traditional rituals. And there's a whole bunch of them, and there's a lot of new rituals, but you don't have to piggyback it on any of those rituals. It could be emerging spontaneously right now somewhere, just as it was emerging spontaneously at all of those points in history. So you'd want to be looking for someone you think is actually doing that process, someone who's embodying the coming together of a whole bunch of different dimensions of life. And if you're working on that in your own life, you probably find a resonance with them if it works for you.
Nice. That's super interesting. That's a great answer. Thank you.
I just want to comment on what you said, Matt, about everything being a buffet. You can just go around the buffet and take a little bit, like a small bite of everything, taste it and see what you like, and then go back and fill your plate with that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree to some degree, but I also think that there could be a superficiality in doing that, or kind of like a lack of direction. But I do agree to some degree. So it's hard to say.
When you said that, I had to think about this research. I don't remember who the person's name, but somebody calculated that there was like something about 67% chance that it would be better to believe in a God than to not believe in a God.
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
I think what you're talking about is Pascal's wager. That's the what you were just saying, like if you, something along the lines of, if there is a God, then it is the God of Christ, and if you don't believe in if you don't believe in the God of Christ, and that is God, then you're going to hell. But if you do believe in the God of Christ, and there is a God of Christ, it is the God of Christ, then you're going to heaven. And if there is no God, there's no harm in not believing in that God is the God of Christ. That's essentially
what I
think.
Philosophical argument, and I think it makes a lot of sense from within a particular cultural context, right? If you're in that same historical cultural world space as Pascal, you might go in on that argument, and there might be someone equivalent to Pascal in some other culture who's going to make that same argument about Krishna or something like that, right? If you yourself are at a transcultural place in your life and thinking, then you can't quite buy that argument in the terms of its specificity, but you can buy it in a more general sense. That it might not be the God of Christ, but it might be that experience upon which people have placed the concept of particular gods historically. And that thing, it's a pretty good gamble to try to have that thing in your life, right? If you're going to access and have a relationship with super meaningfulness in a way that can transform you, you should bet on that rather than bet on its absence.
Yeah, I just looked it up. It was not Pascal's wager, but this person called Stephen D. Unwin. I will copy the link to the.
Sounds good. Thank you. Any other comments and questions from anyone? Any even if you've spoken already.
I just wanted to just to really quickly retouch on the old Pascal's wager. I was just thinking while you guys were talking, I was thinking that basically implicit in the argument of Pascal's wager is that there is no harm in false belief. And I think if you phrase it that way, a lot of people would have a problem with that. But that's kind of what Pascal's wager is saying if you just generalize it. And I think a lot of people would have problems with that statement.
Yeah, absolutely. There's you know, the more specific the concept of the deity, I think the more risk there is in the false belief. The more generalized the experience, the less harm is going to be produced by getting the wrong take on it. But ultimately, I think we need to not be looking at belief, or what Pascal was talking about in terms of belief, as whether or not a particular thing really exists. That's a very limiting and in a lot of ways useless concept. Useless in science to some degree, useless in religion, certainly. You're either performing a procedure that gives you access to a numinous super meaningfulness that makes you want to call it God, or you're not. And if you're not, then who cares what you believe in? You're not getting the experience. And if you are getting the experience, who cares what you believe in? You're getting the experience. So like from a trans-cultural, scientific, rational or post-rational point of view, I think we have to come at it in those terms.
So maybe this is a question for everyone, but who do you all see as like an authentically religious person in modern society, in the sense, and using the definition of someone who's really like embodying like a super connector, connecting all the different elements of life and connecting us to a higher kind of power in whatever sense that means. Do you guys see anyone as embodying that in today's time?
That's a really difficult question, because the only thing you can see as an outsider is the external manifestations of their belief, and they can be pretending just to show off on Facebook or Instagram. Look how religious I am. I'm so awesome. I'm in the temple praying or whatever. Or I'm doing such good charity, giving homeless people food because I'm such a good Christian or Muslim or whatever. And it doesn't mean anything whether they internally really believe. So, and you're
So,
we are only seeing people that are either famous or posting a lot on social media. So it could be any random person in some forest somewhere with no access to internet. You would never know if they are really religious and who could be a really good role model.
I mean, I know what you're saying, and I understand. The way that I see it is that like my definition of like authentically religious in today's world would be someone who must embrace all the different elements of society. So, and in a way externalize their internal beliefs. So in that way, I would think that someone who isolates themselves in nature is maybe not the most authentically religious person, because they're not integrating a lot of elements of what is currently in the modern world, or externalizing that. And I think there needs to be an attempt, in my opinion, to externalize.
Well, that's why I'm trying to draw a distinction between spiritual and religious, right? We could talk about it in different terms, but there's one version of this process that's primarily something that individuals are going to do with themselves. And then there's another version of the similar process that's going to operate interpersonally and socially. If you just go around to all the churches in the city you live in, you'll find a bunch, right? You'll find a bunch of people that aren't impressive, but you'll find a bunch that are, who were drawn to religion thinking that that's specifically what religion was. I think if you go around and talk to a lot of really good scientists, you'll find a small percentage of them that are sort of compulsively trying to link their science to emotion and wonder and cosmology and art and humanism and everything they can think of. There'll be certain political actors that you can get behind. The person I first thought of when you said that was Cornel West, who, whether we agree with his politics or not, touches on a huge number of areas of cultural life and does it in a way where he seems to be overwhelmed by an additional passionate moral energy.
This may seem as not as deep of an example, but I see it as a way that someone famous or popular can just take over people's minds in a way that they didn't expect, just because they have such a hypnotizing effect. So let's think about someone like Beyonce. Like, she's a superstar, like, oh, she's just an R&B soul singer, she can dance really well, blah blah blah, but like, she actually has like literally a religious following. It's actually quite terrifying. She literally there's actually a group of people, I believe, like somewhere on the East Coast, that have Beyonce mass, and they like worship to her music. I'm not joking, they worship to her music. And so she's not meaning to be like a super like religious cult figure, but she is just naturally, by doing what she does. She has awesome outfits, she has like Jay-Z, like the family, like everything seems very perfect and like what people want to like look at when they turn on the TV. So she's not really trying to like break through this whole like spiritual, like metaphysical world or anything. She's just being a worldly modern superstar, and that's how she like gives that like religious effect on people. So open for comments on that.
Well,
Yeah,
when you
I would say she might be, in some ways, she's not necessarily doing it. She just has a set of characteristics that's available for people to use for that purpose, right? One of those characteristics might be that energy flows through her. Another characteristic might be she looks a certain way and she's well known. But the people are using her to get that effect, right? There's a lot of practices, subtle tantric yogas and things like that, where you do that on purpose. You create an imaginary entity, or you work with the person that you're in relationship with to try to divinize them, to make them like a god, so that you can enter into a holy relationship. You sanctify it. So I think people are very hungry for that. And if they're not getting it, they're going to look around for wherever they might be able to get some. Because they know, it sort of organically, instinctively, they know there's something good in it for them if they can enter into a devotional relationship to what seems like a super meaningful thing. And it is good. It's medically good for us if we can get that.
I just have to say, if I hear one more comment that puts doubt on the idea that Beyonce is God, I'm going to report you guys. This is ridiculous.
Heresy.
You are all a bunch of heretics, and you're going to be outed.
But it is so true. Like I noticed that before. People literally treat Beyonce like she's a god, and it makes me feel uncomfortable, honestly. Because otherwise, I feel like I don't really listen to her music, but I feel like I would, or I might like give it a chance or something, if there wasn't this whole like cult around her. But really, people really do treat her as like this god. It's weird.
In the society that we live in now,
Yeah.
Thinking about a structure that was going to incorporate all these different facets of our cultural life, the celebrity facet of cultural life would definitely have to be included in that somehow, right? Mm. We have politics, we have war, we have philosophy, we have science. We also have this phenomenon of these media intensified radiant people who produce this effect. All of that would have to be woven together if you wanted to get an effect in today's world that was similar to the effect that you might have gotten, in medieval Italy when Catholicism was produced.
Yeah, that's true.
We were talking about people following Beyonce. I had to think about Pastafarianism, where people made up the spaghetti monster and actually do organize mass now for that too. And it's even been recognized as an official religion now in some states.
Yeah, it's very easy to scoff at that kind of stuff. And in the last 50 or 60 years, there have been quite a number of attempts to make humorous religions or people trying to create religions for themselves that they could go along with because they were dissatisfied with their existing options. But one of the interesting things is if people get engaged in those processes, they start having a lot of the traditionally religious or spiritual experiences. So one of the reasons why in thinking about it, we have to hold it loosely or kind of put all the entities and phenomenon in quotation marks is because we've seen people get a lot of authentic religious experience out of things that seem totally bizarre, non-traditional, and even like jokes. But jokes can work if you actually do it because it's a response to what you enact. The other side of that is very primitive examples, right? If you go right back to Paleolithic shamanism, there's the idea that almost anything could be sanctified, right? A shaman can walk out of the hut and decide that this rock and this feather and none of the other rocks and none of the other feathers, these ones are going to be sacred. He's somehow seen it orchestrating a huge number of facets of the society's experience. He knows that this thing has this potential, but he can do it with almost anything, right? You have a sacred chicken, you have a sacred diagram, you have a sacred anything. And so one of the ways we see that is with people getting together in a humorous spirit or an experimental spirit and trying to make up one that they think they could go along with. They can divinize that phenomenon the same way as ancient people divinized a local mountain, divinized an animal, or later people divinized a concept or a word or a holy place.
While you were talking about that, I was just thinking of that idea and just the idea of like just saying this is sacred or something, and we might look back at it and say that's kind of ridiculous. Like, why are these stones sacred or something like that? But I was kind of thinking of the idea of it's like if you give, it's a way to give structure around a belief and around a community, and a way for people to structure their lives. And people have to have a structure to their lives, or they just go nowhere. So even if you can put something which is called a useful fiction, just put something there. It's like, okay, this is what we do. And even if it isn't necessarily technically right, if it allows you to give structure to a society and to an individual's life and allows them to orientate themselves, it can be useful, even if it's not in any way literally, verifiable.
Yeah, it's a very practical thing. There's 10,000 different sorts of internal practices, and they all have certain commonalities. There's 10,000 different ways to experience religion, but they all have certain commonalities, and people need them to some degree, especially if you are a community like we are today, facing very large and confusing challenges. You need something where people can come together and access a super meaningfulness that gives them a very reliable sense of meaning and empowerment and access to their own higher capacities and collective mobilization energy, right? So those ancient communities were able to get that for themselves. We're having a struggle trying to do that now, but it's what we need, because if we don't feel something that exceeds our normal possibilities and is supporting us in our move, how are we possibly going to mobilize to fight the various overwhelming crises that are emerging?
Yeah, my own personal opinion on this, which anyway, it's just this idea that I have, is that we're getting so much more information now than we used to, in social media, in the internet and everything, that we're having kind of this crisis of information, because we're seeing that I don't know, kind of like looking at it like Plato's cave or something, we're kind of seeing the cave is kind of having a sheen and it's kind of reflecting back, and we're like, wait a second. Anyway, I think we're having a crisis of getting too much information and being able to synthesize that information into a cohesive framework. Whereas before, religions worked because they were, the amount of information the average person had was so limited that it just made sense to believe in the gods. And now we're like, we have so much more information and we don't have the systems to synthesize that information, which is kind of the core of the issue.
Yeah, it's a much harder task now, right? We have more information and we're less authoritarian in our responses. If you have a low information population who's very authoritarian, then the authorities can just say, here's how it is, and they can all get in on that. in our situation, we have a lot of work to do in terms of sense making so that we could get together on anything. So that's what everybody's sort of struggling with. It's what I see on the news daily. I think it's easier to do that social version if you're a person who's been doing the internal version. So people who are doing spiritual practice are in some form are more likely to be able to get together in that social sense and create a religious practice. But obviously one of the challenges we've got to face is the information challenge of a hypersemantic environment. We need to develop practices for making ourselves somewhat immune to the stimulation of incoming cultural information. It's overwhelming us. It's a different topic, but we're definitely, our brains are not built to accommodate this amount of possibly suggestive information every minute of every day. And a lot of classic religious practices are like that. Like it's a sort of a Taoist approach where you operate in a post-metaphysical or a relaxed skeptical indifference toward concepts and information. Right? You don't take words and categories as seriously in Taoism. You have this spaciousness around them. And that was maybe a luxury that the Taoists could afford back in the day, but now it's a sort of life and death issue that we're all facing. Right? If you have situations where people are being driven to madness by the overwhelming influx of information or killing themselves because of tweets they read, then you're in a situation where it's a sort of life and death issue to teach people to have a spacious indifference toward semantic information. And so that's a sort of preliminary emergency skill I think we need to spread in order to get any of this done.
Any comments and questions about anything? Any topic that we've covered tonight, or anything, or a new topic? Jerome, welcome. I don't know if your audio is working.
I guess I'll just give a quick plug if anybody's interested in my thoughts on some of these things. I have a quick little YouTube. If you look for if you go to YouTube and look for Lies Worth Believing and look for that little icon, I try and answer some really crazy questions. Personally, I find the videos up there, they're of me unwatchable, but he do deal with some of these questions. So I'm just going to throw that out there. I can't watch them, but maybe you can. But I'm trying to answer very, very difficult questions and stumbling along the way.
Lies Worth Believing is a nice way of putting some of this, putting the post-metaphysical part, right? That you don't have to take it as a given. You just have to find some way to work with it, because you're ultimately not going to be able to perfectly validate it anyway.
Yeah, that's kind of the point. The point is I'm not trying to tell you what the truth is, but maybe just find the lies worth believing, find the useful fictions, find the whatever. So the videos themselves are a little bit more technical and scientifically orientated, but yeah, that's the whole concept is kind of the whole what are we going to put up on Plato's wall next?
I like
on the cave wall.
I like all the pragmatism in this chat. We're all like, seems like we're all universally just pragmatic about our philosophies.
There's a spiritual self-confidence issue in that, I think, which is sometimes people who are pragmatic and relativistic, a little bit more free with concepts and truth, they're not always sure that they're capable of getting those spiritual and religious profound effects that they associate with true believers throughout history. And a lot of that true believer stuff was propaganda. They weren't actually doing it, and that's not actually how they did it. But I think that people who are more agnostic and more fluid with the concept of reality and truth are perfectly capable, maybe even more capable than our ancestors, of accessing these things if we can do it right. We need to be very, very confident, have a lot of integrity in our capacity, because this thing we're doing, being agnostic and flexible and pragmatic, there's a huge space that's open for us. And there's a very beautiful way of relating to truth. And there's absolutely no limit that places on our ability to have the most profound possible experiences and to appreciate them in a way that maybe our ancestors couldn't even appreciate them. So I think we're doing something right.
It's right. It's just hard.
Yeah.
Hey, you think about it too. Sorry, go on.
I was just saying I agree. I definitely agree with that. What were you saying, Dan?
I was just gonna say, if you think about it, or at least as I think about it, like the capacity to doubt and to ponder and just to kind of like sit on a rock and go like this, it's kind of late in the evolutionary game. If you think about it, it's like our 10,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, if you did that, you're gonna get eaten by a tiger. So like just our ability to be able to sit here and just ponder these things it's kind of like a new player in the game. So for a way, it isn't all that surprising that we're not as good at it, or at least, we're starting to get good at it now. It's like you did that before, you're going to get eaten by something. So it's kind of like the ability to doubt and to ponder and to be a philosopher. It used to be the philosophers had to be protected by all of society because otherwise they'd just be dead. And now it's kind of like we're having more of a luxury that we can all do this a little bit more, but it doesn't come easy to society, if that makes any sense.
No, it's a risk and it's an effort, and it's been traditionally rare. Even though some of the people who did this were not fragile philosophers, some of them were very dynamic members of the society who set up systems that led that society to have more of a survival advantage going forward. So we are descended from people who were ponderers just as much as we're descended from people who were only worried about the tiger in the bushes.
That makes a lot of sense.
I just want to comment on what Dan just said about philosophy, or thinking about philosophy is rare, or was rare. Well, it made me think about Maslow's pyramid, that self-actualization is at the top after you meet all the other needs. So that's it.
Yeah, and then there's a direct connection between philosophical, spiritual, and religious pursuits and socioeconomic and political situations. Because unless, if you're looking at Maslow's hierarchy, unless you set up a situation that's pretty stable for people so that they don't have to be totally engaged in their stresses, so that they have some freedom to try to put things together and create the excess that takes them up to that next level of needs, you're not going to get there unless there's a whole bunch of stabilization and ease at the bottom. Unless your socioeconomic system is promoting the ease of the citizens to some degree, you're not really going to have a flourishing of any kind of personal or shared faithfulness in any sense.
So with that, we have to wrap up. I just wanted to check in to see if there's any kind of closing comments that maybe Joseph, Nancy, Dan, Jerome, I don't know if you can hear us.
What do I do that for?
Oh, I think I can hear you, Jerome. Any last remarks or comments or anything?
I just want to say thanks for putting this on. This was very interesting, and really appreciated all the good comments.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for participating.
Yeah.
And yeah, well, we're gonna do it every week. We're gonna have a different like author or thought leader or something like that, and hopefully different topics as well. It'll definitely be different topics, but we'll do it every Tuesday, every Monday, whatever today is.
Every Monday.
Yeah, every Monday.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Matt, because originally your question was who would be the most religious person to follow. So
Sure.
why do you, okay, I know Layman just said to that would be the best strategy, but why do you feel you need to follow the best strategy instead of just trying to find out for yourself?
Um,
And slash,
yeah,
do you already have a religious view or not?
to me, the question's too, I mean, it's reductive to me, just because the way I might define religion might be different than the way you might define it. I think I do have a religious view, but maybe I have a different definition of it than you. But for me, I think there's kind of a pretension in only looking inward at yourself to find wisdom. I think that is appropriate, and it's good to look inward to some degree to check in with your, feelings and thoughts and passions about things. And it's definitely important, but there's a lot of the world that if I'm only reflecting inward, that I'm not going to be grasping. And I think that the inward actually comes from what's in the world. The inward comes from the outward. Or it's a dynamic relationship between inward and outward. So the way I see it is like looking outward helps you relate to yourself and helps you find direction that helps you maybe get to the next level or expand and evolve in a way that you don't get when you just purely look inward.
I'd say there's a lot more to religion than having a religious view, and there's a lot more to our insides than looking inward. Right? We should be thinking about what we do religiously, what we do inwardly. So it's one thing to just check and see how you feel and what you think about things, but it's quite another to try to find the different parts of your own system through some kind of practice and try to yoke them together so that you can produce extra insight, new energy, something that helps move you forward in your own path. So I would encourage everybody to be doing some kind of practice where they're taking different parts of their inner experience and trying to weave them together somehow to get a little bit of extra out of that.
Any other thoughts? Okay, with that, guys, I think we're going to conclude there. Thanks for coming. It was really awesome discussion, really lively chat. Thanks for listening, Charles and Nancy. Nice talking to everyone. Joseph, Layman, pleasure to have you on. Dan, thanks for sharing everything. Jerome, I'm sorry about your audio, but we'll see you next week, hopefully.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Cheers. See you, Joe.